morning. It's a pleasure for me to be with you, and thank you for your time this morning. I would like to share a little bit with how I got to this place where I am working. I work for the National United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. But prior to that, I worked in the Diocese of Fort Worth in their social justice office, where I kind of supervised some of the low-income community organizing as well as some of the social justice work of the diocese. And before that, I worked for AT&T as a manager and supervisor there. And then I just got the call to go into church work and encouraged by the local bishop to go into church work, even though they were paying me a little less than half of what I was making at AT&T. And I have never missed it. I mean, I've never missed except on obviously on paydays. But it's extremely gratifying, the work that I do. And I was really pleased to be called to come to work in the national office in Washington, D.C. Faith-based community organizing is incredibly dynamic on a lot of different ways. I'm going to share a little bit with you, but I would encourage you to delve more into it. And it's got a very, very rich history, and it's very, very compelling in a lot of ways. A way that engages low-income people in a way that probably nowhere else does. The Catholic Campaign for Human Development, where I'm pleased to work, has invested a great deal in low-income community organizing over the last 50 years. We've been doing it for 50 years to the tune of somewhere around $400 million and over 20,000 organizations in that period of time that we've actually assisted with grants. So that's the perspective I'm going to bring to the conversation, if you will, that we have a great deal of investment. It's kind of an informed perspective that is based out of that. And I would just say, too, that it often gets confused that because I work for the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, we fund Catholic community organizing. Most of our funded groups, the overwhelming majority of funded groups, are with mixed denominations. The denominations of different faiths, and in many cases, in most cases, there are very few Catholic congregations, but there is a respect for the Catholic Church, and folks who are organizing understand when they come into funding consideration. I want to share a little bit about a historical overview, maybe what a faith-based community organization is, what it is today, and maybe even a little bit what our hopes are for the future. When you look at the history of community organizing, the official start, if you will, that folks give credit to is with Saul Alinsky back in the 1930s, back in the back of the yards, where he organized low-income meat packers who were just coming out of the Great Depression, who were really, really, really neglected, who were losing their jobs, who had no benefits. So he looked to the local faith community, many of them Catholic churches, to come together and organize in a way that might be able to achieve some of the things that they were being denied. It's been wildly successful over the years. That's kind of the official start. But I would say that organizing kind of had an unofficial restart, if you will, back in the 60s during the Civil Rights Movement, when there were many organizations, particularly faith-based organizations, small African-American churches, AME, CME churches, who came together, who too looked at the signs of the times, who too looked and saw what was happening and decided they wanted to do something about it, that they wanted to do something about the racial polarization, the lack of economic opportunities, and the segregation and those kinds of things. So they came together, acknowledging and realizing that either one of them individually did not have the kind of power that it would take to affect change. So they came together in a very informal way, and it probably wasn't any more than one pastor calling another pastor saying, let's meet at your church, let's meet at your church, and come together and do some things that are very, very, very powerful in the movement, in the historical movement. I think that has to be considered in terms of community organizing. And obviously, it was faith-based, because a lot of the activities happened in houses of worship. So what is a faith-based community organization? Faith-based congregations come together, if you will, and they create a larger organization based on shared values, shared interests, and the desire to fulfill themselves and fulfill, if you will, the congregation's mission on earth. I think the attraction to people is bolstered by the fact that they see that their faith their faith institution is concerned about their day-to-day lives. They're concerned about them having food, clothing, shelter, gainful employment, safety. They see that their faith community has that. And that actually bolstered or actually helps propel their concern with both what's happening in their day-to-day lives and the way that they're worshiping. So the faith commission, in addition to worshiping, is also concerned with those needs to educational opportunities, and most importantly, to participate in the public square and where so many decisions that affected their lives. And I would say too that as these faith communities come together, these different denominations come together, that they're respectful of the preaching and the teachings of other denominations. There's nothing more beautiful than to have a meeting in a synagogue basement where a Christian pastor begins the meeting in prayer, and a Muslim imam ends the meeting in prayer. And as they walk out at the end of the meeting, sharing, that I didn't know that your faith embraced this. I didn't know that your faith embraced that. And seeing how they can walk together with a shared interest and concern about what's happening to their local communities. So I think there's that wonderful interdependence, and there's that wonderful appreciation that doesn't happen in a lot of situations, but it does happen in faith-based community organizing. They realize that they can wield much more power working together in the public arena as unified organizations, and by being a voice of the community, and if they work towards things like leadership development. And what I mean by that, they look at some of the voids in the experiences, some of the voids in the public education, if you will, some of the voids in trying to strengthen leaders. And the identified leaders is everyone in the organization, because they say that everyone is an expert in their lived experiences, and they bring those experiences to bear in faith-based community organizing. So they do leadership development, which means that they do things like teach people how to participate in the public square, to teach people how to interact with elected officials, to teach people how to do things, even things like public speaking, even things like basic 101, civics 101. And they research the issues that are happening in their individual communities and are given the tools to deal with those issues. So they're given a voice, they're given courage, they're given conviction, and all of this is with the endorsement and the encouragement of their faith communities, again, which I think helps give them wings. They look at one of the mantras, and I'm sure that this is familiar with some of you, is looking at the world as it is and the world as it should be. The world as it is and the world as it should be. Again, each person brings their own lived experiences, experts in their own lived experiences, and share that with one another. Faith-based community organizing is nothing if it's not based on relationships. Relationships beginning with individual face-to-face interviews and conversations that are based on story, that are based on individual personal stories. I'm glad to hear about the class doing autobiographies and sharing those. That's, in a sense, that's what faith-based community organizing is really based on. And that it does have an opportunity to listen and to share and to find out what are those shared values, and based on those shared values, what are the shared interests and concerns we have that are keeping us from living in a world as it should be. A lot of the faith-based community organizations are linked to networks. So some of the networks are familiar: the Industrial Areas Foundation, DART, Direct Area Research Training Institute, the Gamaliel Foundation, as well as Faith in Action. There was once PICO. And all of them do tremendous work in terms of bringing folks together, offering things like technical assistance and training and those kinds of things. But each organization, each individual organization is autonomous for itself and has its own identity. It identifies its own issues and works within its own community. There's an old African proverb that says, "I am because we are, and because we are, therefore I am." I exist because my community exists, and my community exists because I exist. And to the degree any one of those suffers, has difficulty, the individual suffers, the community suffers. The community suffers, the individual suffers. The community thrives, the individual thrives. So it's a relationship that I think speaks to what faith-based community organizations are. We hear time and time again about how individual parishes and churches, that once they're engaged in community organizations, that they become much better as parishes. The individual parishioner becomes much more engaged as a parishioner, but he becomes much more active as a church member. And the organization becomes stronger because it brings people who have created leaders who can speak in the marketplace and go out and act on behalf of those who need help. I mentioned a little earlier that there's no real conflict of ideology or tradition. In fact, there seems to be, as I mentioned, a deeper appreciation of each other's faith and each other's religion. And to give you an example of a few organizations, there's one, Faith and Action Strength Together, or FAST, down in Florida. They work with their dark group. They work with the detention of young people to get civil citations where, when we were going to school, or certainly when I was going to school, I would get sent to the office for bad behavior. And these young people were actually apprehended, taken in, given the kind of record that would follow them for several years, not just in the school system, but even beyond. What they worked for is to create a system whereby they would get civil citations, and these young people would not have the kinds of records that would keep them from employment or participation in the military service or those kinds of things. It was tremendous effort that what they did throughout the state, but they also this group also works on things like affordable housing and have just recently taken on an effort to point out the inequities of attention to how the environment, how climate change is impacting low-income communities along the eastern coast. A tremendous, ambitious activity. Dallas Area Interfaith, which is a IAF group, has worked tirelessly to help create an organization and where parishes and churches might be able to issue acceptable identification to immigrants, where they won't have to be detained without having a proper driver's license. For those who might, are not using the driving system, we're riding buses and walking and those kinds of things, who are often stopped without any kind of identification. They created a system, or helped push forward a system, where immigrants might be able to get these kinds of identifications from churches. And again, it's because they have a trust for the church and the faith community that they don't necessarily have for some of the development. The Dallas Area Interfaith works a great deal on police and community relations, bringing together police and community after this very, very tragic situation several years ago, where several police officers were killed in the city of Dallas. And they also, and right now, are partnering with healthcare to help in assistance for folks to be tested and to deal with some of the implications of COVID. Faith in Action in East Bay, they're working tirelessly on things like gun violence. They're a PICO organization working on immigration efforts, as well as something that often gets ignored in larger municipal areas, the whole notion of what illegal dumping is, where people from all over the community come to these neighborhoods and dump some of their trash instead of disposing of it in a proper way. I just have to say, as a person, and maybe I'm a little bit biased in that it works. It works. Not every initiative, not every opportunity that folks have come together to try to confront a system has succeeded in the way that folks want to, but it works in that it has brought folks together. Relationships have been forged, lifetime relationships, where even long past folks are the time where folks are participating and actively working in the organization. They become friends and people that you can call on and depend on. And the tremendous thing about faith-based community organizing is that when it works and it works well, it has congregations and from low-income communities and congregations from high-income communities who come together and they'll work together. And there's an opportunity for them to see the world of each other. The high income community is able to see that this isn't just something that folks are just making up. This isn't just sour grapes. They're seeing that there's concern for people and their children just as much as it is for them. And these people are able to see, low income people are able to see what the mindset is, or the thinking of, is of people who find themselves kind of distanced or insulated from where the problems are. In terms of what community organizing has for the future, I'm reminded of a quote by Martin Luther King. If you just indulge me just reading it, it says, "If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without morals or spiritual authority. If the church does not participate actively in the struggle for peace and for economic and racial justice, it will forfeit its loyalty of millions and cause people everywhere to say that it has atrophied its will." And I'm inclined to agree with that the church has to play a more powerful role in interacting with institutions that keep people in poverty. It's extremely critical now. And as we mentioned earlier, yes, poverty has been reduced, and for a lot of different reasons, and not the least of which is some of the activities of these faith-based community organizations who are steadfast in doing everything they can to help reduce poverty, who continues to do that. Again, not everything they do is successful, but overwhelming, they're successful in forging relationships. They're successful in addressing some of the institutions that cause that. But in terms of the future, I'm struck, as I heard earlier, that there are people from other portions of the world. We're working with some folks in Great Britain and England right now who is also embracing community organizing, faith-based community organizing as a way to affect change. And they too have found it to being very, very successful. And so we've had a couple of calls with webinars with people around the world who are trying to, who see this as being a very, very valuable and helpful tool in affecting change. You know, Pope Francis is extremely enamored with the idea of people coming together. He's convened a group of people in what's called the World Meeting of Popular Movements. And popular movements are organizations that are working together to affect change. And he's called together 3 of them. I've attended one of them, a regional meeting in Washington, D.C., as well as in Rome with him for a kind of a planning meeting. But he's calling another one for October the 19th. And it embraces and encourages people. It reminds people of the power that they already have. While we talk about empowering people, his thing is that you have power because you're, for no other reason, that you're made in the image and likeness of God, which is a tenet, I think, that a lot of faith-based communities have. It's something that they kind of have in common. And the popular movements he has everything gathered from people who are cartoneros, people who collect cardboard for recycling. I mean, that's their job. That's where they make their living. He brought them to Rome to encourage them to keep on keeping on. People who are struggling for housing in Gambia, he brought them to Rome. And people who were struggling in the United States, you know, with the whole idea of racial reckoning and he brought them to Rome. And then he did a regional meeting in California. So, but anyway, I mentioned all of that because there's a meeting coming up on October the 19th. Obviously, it's going to be virtual. Well, he wants to keep that movement alive, And I think he recognizes, as I do, that the issues that affect us now, we need organizing and the building of relationships even more, particularly faith-based community organizing. I mean, the whole idea of racial reckoning and the polarization associated with it, and you know, and I mentioned that community organizations bring people together of different races and ethnicities and communities and faith groups, kind of like nowhere else. And we have the whole left-right division that too brings folks together. It's not the kind of mix that we would like right now, but community organizing does have a way of doing that. There's concern for efforts to assist those who are in need, and at the same time, stressing self-responsibility and self-determination. So there's this beautiful, beautiful mix of both what's considered a left ideology, concern for people, assisting them where they are, and the whole idea of fostering and creating self-determination and self-responsibility that many on the right would say. So the whole beautiful left-right mesh is there in faith-based community organizing if we embrace for what it really is. The whole idea of how we find ourselves in this whole economic polarization and housing and unemployment, education, and those kinds of things are issues I'm convinced that faith-based community organizing is going to have to embrace. COVID has exposed so very much, so many voids in our community, so many gaps that exist in our community as it relates to working with low-income people. And the whole issue of it's kind of a back to the future thing. It was back in how I mentioned in '68, the civil rights movement was such a tremendous movement toward getting people engaged and participating in the political process. And we find ourselves now with voter suppression, with trying to discourage people from voting, trying to make it harder. And I think if you examine it very closely, some of the initiatives very closely, it's targeted at faith-based communities in that, some of the Souls to the Polls effort and some of the ways that folks encourage people to participate happen at the very basis of church, of the religious communities. So I think that those are things that are looming, that faith-based community organizations are going to have to deal with and attack on a firmer level. The idea of police community relationships is something that's certainly still in the forefront, although it doesn't have the headlines as it did back with George Bland and George and Floyd and Sandra Bland. But there's still a great deal of concern and polarization. Obviously, youth and violence in school is something that faith-based community organizing are continuing to work on. But I think, again, going back to something I said a little bit earlier, is the hook and the connection is the faith-based portion of it. Organizing is tremendous. Community organizing is tremendous. But I think there's a different dimension when folks are able to latch their faith onto it. I'm reminded of we're all familiar, I think, with the Flint water crisis, where folks were basically their water supply was poisoned because of a financial decision where low-income communities were not at the table in making the decision. So the water they got piped in and diverted to them was extremely high lead based. But what I was in terms of community organizing, there was a lack of, even after all of this was exposed, there was a lack of engagement among low-income people because there was just a tremendous distrust. I mean, they would go and they would canvass communities. They would being the civic authorities and people canvass communities, oftentimes law enforcement, in some cases even military. They would come and they would knock on doors and try to leave flyers and get information. And there was such a distrust that no one paid them any attention. And one low-income immigrant community and a group of, they engaged the National Guard to try to help them with getting information out, as well as supplying people water with cases of water. So they went through the neighborhood with cases of water, and no one would ever answer their door. Now, if they were, understandably, they were immigrants, some of them possibly undocumented, who saw a person in a uniform knocking on their door. It's pretty good sense that they're not going to answer. I don't know that I would answer the door, even if they did have cases of water outside. But they had information and cases of water, but they didn't. It wasn't until the wisdom of some of the policymakers that we need to engage the faith community. So they engaged the faith community who began community organizing, who began engaging folks, who when they went to the exact same door and they recognized that there was a member from their church or their parish who had water and information and those kinds of things to help them get through a very tremendous and terrible crisis that's going to affect them and the community for years and years to come. then they were able to not just embrace, open the door, get the water, get the information, get engaged and plugged in with other resources. Then they were able to get the kind of stuff that would help them survive, as well as connect them with neighbors and community, and build a faith-based community organization that exists. There's tons and tons and tons of stories I might share with you, but I'm going to stop right there and see if there's any reflections or questions that folks may have.